In this video, we are going to be talking about the kinetic molecular theory of gases. So when we talked about the various gas laws, it basically helped us understand what would happen when there is a change in pressure and or when there's a change in temperature, what happens to the pressure. Basically, all of them gave us an understanding about what happens in a very large scale. But however, what actually happens in a very molecular scale was given by the kinetic molecular theory of gas. So it is actually a model that helps us understand the various observations that were made. And it actually tries and explains the various behavior of gases that we do observe. So let's begin with the first postulate. And for each postulate, we'll be discussing the postulate itself and its justification. The first one is gases consist of a large number of identical particles, atoms or molecules that are so small. So obviously molecules or atoms, they're very small and gases consist of the large number of such particles. And this is basically in accordance with the molecular theory of matter. Postulate 2. The particles of gases are so far apart on the average that the actual volume of the molecules is negligible in comparison to the empty spaces between them. So in this postulate, we're talking about how, so first of all, before we start, when we have a gas, right? If you have it in a small container, it will occupy the space inside that container. Now, if you assume the same amount of gas is in an entire room, it's assumed the gaseous molecules are spread around in the entire room. So this in turn means that the volume of the molecules is quite negligible. Over here, uh, I mean, this is basically the gas itself, okay, and it's in, let's assume it's in this container. And what I've done is I've taken all these circles, which are assumed to be molecules, and I've placed them in a proper order. And if you notice, the volume of the molecule is on a comparative note to the volume of the container. The volume of the molecules is quite negligible. And this is all the empty space between the gaseous molecules, and that is way more than the volume of the molecules of the gas itself. So that's the reason this postulate came up. And also, one more very important thing, gases are highly compressible. So if we talk about compressibility, the reason they are compressible in the first place because of the empty spaces in between them. So when we apply some amount of pressure, the intermolecular spaces will decrease, and then there will be a decrease in the volume of the gas. And the volume of the gas itself, the molecules itself, is quite small, as I told you before. The third one, there is no force of attraction between the particles of a gas at ordinary temperature and pressure. So at normal conditions of temperature and pressure, you do not notice a lot. I mean, we see that these molecules are quite far apart, but as there is an increase in pressure, what happens is these molecules start getting close to each other, right? And so they when we release that pressure, these molecules will start moving away from each other, and there will be a high amount of space in between them. This is only possible if there is less or no force of attraction between the particles of the gas at ordinary temperature and pressure. Next one, postulate number 4, particles of a gas are always in constant and random motion. Now, if they are not, now if we had solids, the molecules of solids would have been like arranged in a proper order and they would be fixed in a particular place. But gases, on the other hand, they move freely and so they do not have a fixed shape. And if in case we assumed, okay, these gas molecules are supposed to be, fixed, and then in that case, gases would have had a definite shape and definite volume as well. So, but that's not observed. So particles of the gas are always in constant and random motion. Next one, particles of a gas move in all possible directions in a straight line. During the random motion, they collide with each other and with the walls of the container. Pressure exerted by the gas as the result of the collision of the particles with the walls of the container. Now, if you remember, I don't know if you remember this, but there's something called as the Tyndall effect that's observed. Okay, so basically when sunlight shines through a particular place, and the dust particles will move in like this constant motion. Now, if you notice the movement of those dust particles, they're quite a zigzag, they're quite mesmerizing, but they're in a very zigzag manner. So these particles of solids are colliding with each other in a particular way. So this also implies that the gases in that, I mean, the gas molecules in that particular area are also moving in the same way. So if you notice over here, the molecules of the gas are not only colliding with each other, but they're also colliding with the walls of the container. And because they're colliding with the walls of the container, they keep hitting the walls. And so what happens is the walls itself will have some amount of force acted on it by these molecules. And that's why we say that the pressure is exerted by the gas as a result of collision of the particles with the walls of the container. Postulate number 6. Collision of gas molecules are perfectly elastic. This means that the total energy of molecules before and after the collision remains the same. So there may be an exchange of energy between the colliding molecules. The individual energies might change, but the sum of their energies remains constant. Now, let's assume that if this particular motion was the collision of the gas was not elastic, what would happen is each time these gas molecules would have lost some amount of energy, and after a particular point in time, they would, basically stand still, but that's not something we observe. So the collision is considered to be perfectly elastic, which means two molecules of gases hit each other, and then basically there's some amount of energy that gets split. Okay, so not necessary for the molecule which was highly energetic to maintain that energy. There might have been a transfer or an exchange of energy taking place. So one of them might land up being slow, the other one being fast, but the total amount of energy before and after of these two molecules is going to stay the same. Again, if it was not the case, then these molecules would stop and we would basically have no motion in these molecules, and that is not something we observe. Next one is postulate 7. At any particular time, different particles in a gas have different speeds, and hence they have different kinetic energies. Now, if you remember, when we talked about Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution, it was quite clear that we are not able to say that, okay, this is the speed of this molecule, this particular molecule, okay, that molecule is this fast, this molecule is this fast. That's quite impossible, right? But they gave us a distribution curve, which gave us a maximum fraction of molecules having a particular speed, right? That was called UMP. But so we can't figure out what at what speed a gas molecule is going to move at, but we are able to figure out, the average. But at a particular time, we know majority of these particles will have different speeds, and so they're going to have different kinetic energies. This itself is quite a good example as to how one of these molecules is quite slow, one of them are fast, they're all colliding with each other and against the walls of the container as well. Postulate number 8. This is the last one. If a molecule has a variable speed, then it must have variable kinetic energy. Under these circumstances, we can only talk about average kinetic energy. In kinetic theory, it is assumed that the average kinetic energy of gas molecules is directly proportional to the absolute temperature. So if you remember we talking about heating of a gas, what happens is when the gas is heated at a constant volume, the pressure is going to increase. And this in turn implies that the kinetic energy is increasing, and what happens, the molecules will start moving at a very fast rate, and they will start colliding with each other and against the walls of a container more frequently, and this in turn will lead to an increase in pressure. And this is why the kinetic energy of the gas molecules is directly proportional to the absolute temperature. So from the kinetic theory of gases, it is able to derive the gas laws, and calculations and the predictions actually agree with the experimental data. But there was some amount of issues that was also observed, which we will be discussing about in the next video. So let me just quickly recap. The first postulate consists of large number of identical particles that are so small. This is to do with the molecular theory of matter. The next one is the particles of gases are so far apart that on the average, the actual volume of the molecules is negligible in comparison to the empty spaces between them. Now we just arrange these particles in a proper order over here, and you can see that volume occupied by these particles is negligible compared to the total empty space which is present in between them. So basically all this empty space is this one in this case. The next one, postulate 3, there is no force of attraction between the particles of a gas at ordinary temperature and pressure. So when the pressure is released, what happens is the gas molecules start moving farther apart, and this wouldn't have been the case if there was less or no force of attraction between the particles of gases at ordinary temperature and pressure. Postulate number 4, particles of a gas are always in constant and random motion, and this is, I mean, the particles of the gas have a lot of free space in between them, and so they are able to move. Not only that, we and if they had like fixed positions, they would have a proper arrangement and they would have had a fixed shape, but that's not something we observe, so they are always in constant and random motion. Next one, particles of a gas move in all possible directions in straight lines during their random motion. They collide with each other and the walls of the container. Pressure is exerted by the gas as the result of the collision of these particles with the walls of the container. So not only the collision is happening between the particles itself, it's also happening with against the walls of the container. Secondly, these particles are going to move in a very zigzag motion. If you notice sunlight, the Tyndall effect, you see the dust particles swirling and moving around, and it's assumed that because the solids are moving like that, the gases present over there would also move in the same manner. And the pressure which is exerted is because of these collisions of the various particles against the walls of the container. The next one, collisions of gas molecules are perfectly elastic. This means that the total energy of molecules before and after the collision remain the same. There may be an exchange of energy between the colliding particles, their individual energies, but this may change, but the sum of their energies remains constant. If the collision was not elastic, the kinetic energy would have been, it would have gotten over at one particular point, and then the molecules would have stopped moving, but that's not something we observe. The seventh one, at any particular time, different particles in the gas have different speeds and hence different kinetic energies, obviously, because there is going to be an exchange of energy between the molecules. And so that in turn led to them having different speeds as well. And that's what is given in the previous, that's what we studied, the Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution. The next one, if a molecule has a variable speed, then it must have variable kinetic energy. Under these circumstances, we can only talk about average. And in the kinetic theory, it is assumed that the average kinetic energy of the gas molecule is directly proportional to the absolute temperature. So when there is an increase in temperature at a particular volume, these molecules will start moving more vigorously, and that in turn will lead to an increase in pressure, right? And that actually, I certainly managed to remember an example where you basically heat up a balloon. What will happen is, unless the outer covering burns, I guess. But if you notice, there might be, when there is an increase in temperature, okay, so if it's a very hot sunny day, what will happen is, if you take the balloon outside, these molecules will start moving more because of the increase in temperature, and they'll start exerting more pressure against the walls of the container, and in this case it's a balloon, and that will lead to it for it to pop. And that's a perfect example of this particular thing. So with that, we're done with the kinetic molecular theory of gases. In the next video, we'll be continuing with this chapter. I believe we'll be talking about liquefaction of gases. No. I will be talking about the ideal gas and correction in the ideal gas equation.